There are stories we hear that are easy to forget, and then there are the ones that linger. They take root deep in your thoughts and return to you during the quietest moments, when the world feels too still and the shadows seem alive. The story I'm about to share with you is one of those. It begins in a small neighborhood, where people know each other by name, where houses stand in neat rows, and children play together in cul-de-sacs. But something unusual happens here. Every night, at exactly 3:03 a.m., a sound drifts through the street. A whistling. Simple, steady, almost cheerful. And yet, no one dares to look for the source. Not anymore. This isn't just a story about a strange sound. It's about rules, warnings, and the consequences of breaking them. It's about what happens when curiosity pushes someone to look for answers best left undiscovered. And if you think this could never happen to you, let me assure you, some questions should never be asked. For years, I've lived in this neighborhood. I've seen the blessings of staying here, the good fortune that follows every resident. But I've also heard the whispers about what happens when you break the rule. The one rule everyone here knows by heart. Never look outside when the whistling begins, because some things don't like being seen. Tonight, I'll take you back to where it all began, to a night when someone broke that rule. When a choice was made, a chain of events was set into motion that no one could stop. This is the story of the whistler who walks past my house every night at 3:03, and I urge you to listen closely. In this story, the warnings aren't just for the people living in it. They might be for you too. Imagine a neighborhood so ordinary it feels safe. Houses lined up like chess pieces, trimmed hedges framing clean sidewalks, and every home glowing with warm porch lights. Kids laugh and ride their bikes during the day while parents chat over fences, sharing stories about weekend plans. It's the sort of place where people leave their doors unlocked and sleep soundly. At least, that's how it feels during the day. But everything changes when the clock strikes 3:03 a.m. That's when it happens. Like clockwork. You hear it, soft at first, almost like it's testing the air. A tune so cheerful it feels wrong in the darkness. The sound should belong in daylight, not creeping through shadows. And it always starts from the same place, down at the end of the lane. My family lives halfway down the street. That means we hear it every single night. Like everyone else, we know the rule. You don't talk about it during the day. You don't try to figure it out. And above all, you never, ever look. It sounds simple, but rules like this exist for a reason. We learned that the hard way. When I was younger, my sister, let's call her Nina, and I was curious. We'd sneak out of our rooms, tiptoe past the hall, and sit on the kitchen floor. From there, we could hear it clearly as it passed. Da-da-da-da-dum. Over and over, a cheerful melody floats through the stillness. We never spoke while it happened. We just sat silently, letting the sound crawl over us like it was alive. And even though we were curious and kids desperate to know more, we never tried to look. We knew better. The house wasn't just a home. It was a fortress. My dad made sure of that. Every evening, just before bedtime, he would walk from room to room, locking the shutters. They weren't normal shutters, either. Heavy canvas blinds latched tight and locked with small keys. He kept the keys on his nightstand, always within reach, as if he didn't trust anyone else with them. And I knew why. Because if anyone ever opened those blinds at the wrong time, the whistling might not just pass by. Nina and I didn't understand why he was so strict about it back then. It felt like an overreaction. We thought maybe it was just a grown-up's way of scaring us into obedience. But there was something about how he moved when he locked those shutters, the urgency in his hands, and how he checked and rechecked each latch. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, like he knew exactly what he was protecting us from. That sound, it's hard to describe how it feels to hear it. The first time, it catches you off guard. It seems innocent at first, even playful. But then as it grows louder, a cold weight settles in your chest. It's not the tune itself. It's what it represents. You know something is out there, walking, moving closer, passing by, and you pray it doesn't stop. My dad never explained the whistling to us. He'd change the subject if we asked. My mom didn't talk about it, though I sometimes caught her sitting on the couch at night, staring toward the window as the sound passed. She never looked, of course, but I always wondered why she sat there night after night listening. It was almost like she was waiting for something, or someone. For years, we followed the rule. We ignored the sound. We locked our windows. And for years, the whistling moved on, night after night, leaving us untouched, until the night someone decided the rule didn't apply to them. That's when everything we thought we knew about our quiet little street changed forever. The whistler was a mystery, but it wasn't the only thing that made our neighborhood unusual. You could call it charmed, lucky even. It wasn't just the big things, though there were plenty of those, like my sister Nina, who was born sick, too fragile to even leave the hospital at first. When we moved here, the doctors couldn't explain it, but she got better, fast, faster than anyone thought possible. But it wasn't just us. Everyone in the neighborhood seemed to benefit. There were stories of neighbors winning radio contests they didn't remember entering, unexpected raises at work, and even finding long-lost heirlooms buried in their backyards. The gardens here always seemed greener, the flowers brighter. Even the weather seemed kinder to us. And yet, there was something else behind every smile and shared laugh, something no one talked about unless they had to. You see, the luck wasn't free. It came with a price. One rule whispered in hushed tones to every family that moved in: never look at the whistler, because if you did, you'd lose it all. Your luck, your happiness, your light, forever. It wasn't just rumors. There were stories, documented tragedies, people who broke the rule and paid the price. I never saw the manila envelope, but I knew my parents did the night we moved in. Inside were clippings from old newspapers, accounts of neighbors who had been too curious. Neighbors who peeked outside their windows at 3:03 a.m. were never the same. I overheard the conversation that night. My parents were sitting in the kitchen with 4 strangers, the welcoming committee. They were friendly enough, bringing over food and small gifts, but there was tension. When they started talking about the whistler, their voices dropped and they leaned in closer, like the sound alone might summon it. It doesn't want to hurt anyone, one said, but it doesn't like being watched. If you see it, even for a second, everything changes. My mom didn't believe them at first. She laughed, accusing them of playing some bizarre prank. My dad, though, he didn't laugh. He grew up hearing stories like this, tales passed down from his parents and grandparents. Strange beings that walked among us, neither good nor evil, just different. Things you didn't cross, rules you didn't break. That night, after the welcoming committee left, my dad wasted no time. He went straight to the hardware store, bought the thickest canvas blinds he could find, and installed them on every window before dinner was even on the table. He didn't wait for questions. He didn't offer explanations. And when my sister and I tried to sneak into the kitchen to hear the whistling that first night, he caught us, his face more serious than I'd ever seen it. Never look, he said, no matter what. Never. It wasn't just fear in his voice. It was a certainty, like he knew exactly what would happen if we disobeyed. And for years, we didn't. Nina and I stuck to the rules. Sure, we listened from the kitchen sometimes, but we never peeked outside. Not once. But my dad, sometimes I'd wake up at night and see him sitting on the couch, holding a baseball bat, staring at the locked windows as the whistling passed by. My mom was different. She didn't talk about it much, but once or twice a month, I'd catch her sitting there, too, just listening. Her face was unreadable. Was it fear? Curiosity? Something else? I wanted to ask her, but the words always caught in my throat. Somehow, even as a kid, I knew there were questions better left unanswered. For years, we lived with the whistling like it was part of the air, a sound as regular as the clock ticking. We ignored it. We followed the rules. And for years, we were fine, until someone didn't follow the rule. And then everything changed. For years, life on our street followed an unspoken rhythm. The whistler came and went, and no one dared to challenge the rule. But now and then, the rhythm broke when someone new moved in. It didn't happen often. Most families stayed for years. After all, why leave a place where everything seems to go your way? But then came the Martins. They were a small family, a father, a mother, and their 12-year-old son, Holden. They moved into the house right next to ours after the previous owner, Mrs. Maddie, passed away. She'd lived there for decades, well into her 90s. Everyone said she'd had a long life, but I always wondered, had she ever looked? The Martins seemed nice enough, friendly, eager to settle in. My dad and the rest of the welcoming committee visited them the evening they moved in. They brought the usual, a casserole dish, a gift basket, and a manila folder. My dad didn't talk much about what was inside that folder, but I knew it contained the stories, the warnings. And I could tell by his look when he came home that night whether the new family had taken them seriously. At first, it seemed like they had. For weeks, they were careful. I'd hear Holden's dad locking their shutters at night, just like my dad did. Their windows were always covered by dusk. And Holden's parents even started chatting with mine about how quiet and peaceful the neighborhood was. It seemed like they understood the rules. But Holden was different. Holden was 12, a year younger than me, and full of questions. Questions that no one wanted to answer. What's the big deal about the whistler? He'd ask. Why does everyone act so weird about it? Nina and I didn't say much to him at first. We were taught to avoid those conversations. But Holden didn't stop asking. And when his curiosity wasn't satisfied, it started to fester. It wasn't long before his questions turned into challenges. What if it's just an old guy playing a prank? He said one afternoon. Or some stray dog with a broken squeaky toy. Nina and I exchanged a look, but we didn't answer. Deep down, though, I could tell he didn't believe in the rules. Not really, and that terrified me. One night, Holden's parents had to leave town unexpectedly. They asked if he could stay with us. My parents agreed, though I noticed my dad hesitating, his fingers lingering on the edge of the doorframe as he nodded. It was just one night, after all. What could go wrong? At first, it felt like a regular sleepover. We ate dinner, played video games, and watched movies in the den. Holden seemed restless, though. He couldn't stop glancing at the windows, although they were locked tightly behind the heavy blinds. When the clock ticked closer to midnight, he finally said it. The words I'd been dreading all night. "Have you ever tried looking?" he asked. His voice was low, but filled with energy, like he'd been holding the question all evening. Nina and I froze. The air in the room felt heavier somehow. I shook my head. "We don't talk about that," I said. But Holden wasn't done. "It's just a sound," he insisted. "How bad could it be? Maybe it's just some animal or a neighbor messing around. Don't you ever wonder?" Nina looked at me, her face pale. I could see the fear in her eyes. I wanted to tell Holden to stop, to drop it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just said, "Let's play another game." For a while it worked. We distracted ourselves with games and snacks, pretending everything was normal. But as the clock inched closer to 3 a.m., Holden's energy shifted. He started pacing, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt, glancing at the windows more frequently. And then he said it. "I know where the key is," he said. "Your dad keeps it on his nightstand." My stomach dropped. I wanted to deny it, to call him a liar, but the truth was, he was right. My dad had stopped hiding the key years ago, confident we all knew better than to use it. Holden saw the panic on my face and grinned. "It's almost time," he said, holding up the key. "We'll just take a quick peek. That's all. What's the worst that could happen?" Nina and I begged him not to do it, but Holden was already heading toward the nearest window. And that's when I heard it. The sound that had haunted me every night since I was 6. The whistling Da-da-da-da-dum. The melody was light and playful, but it felt like it was clawing at my chest at that moment. Holden froze for a second, the key trembling in his hand. And then he moved. I wanted to stop him. I should have stopped him. But before I could, he pulled the blind open. Holden never believed the warnings. To him, the whistle was nothing more than a bedtime story designed to scare children into obedience. He thought he was smarter than the rest of us. He thought he could outsmart the rule. But that night, as the clock struck 3:03 a.m., Holden did something no one else dared to do. And everything changed. The sound was everywhere. It filled the room, weaving through the air like it was alive. Da-da-da-da-dum. Over and over again, growing louder as if the whistler was right outside. Holden was frozen for a moment, his hand hovering over the latch. I wanted to grab and stop him, but fear held me in place. Nina clung to my arm, her nails digging into my skin. I could feel her shaking, knowing she was just as terrified as I was. "Holden, don't," I whispered. My voice barely carried over the sound. But he didn't listen. He grinned at us. The same grin he did all night, the one that said he thought this was a game. And then he unlocked the latch. The moment the blind lifted, the whistling stopped, just like that. The silence was so complete it felt like the world had been muted. My heart pounded as I reached for Nina, pulling her close and turning her away from the window. "Don't look," I said. My voice was shaking, but I meant it. No matter what, don't turn around. But Holden looked. I don't know what he saw, but I'll never forget the sound he made. It wasn't a scream, not at first. It was a gasp, sharp and ragged like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. And then the screaming started. I couldn't see what was outside the window. I didn't want to, but I could see Holden. His face was pale, his lips trembling as he stumbled from the glass. Tears streamed down his cheeks, and his eyes, they looked hollow like the light inside him had been snuffed out. "What did you see?" I wanted to ask, but the words wouldn't come. I could only hold Nina tighter and pray that whatever was outside wouldn't come in. And then came the knocking. It started at the front door, slow, deliberate. 3 knocks, loud enough to rattle the walls. Then silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then it started again, this time at the back door, then at the windows. The sound moved around the house one by one, circling us like a predator. Nina buried her face in my shoulder, her small body shaking with fear. "What's happening?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know if we were safe. My parents were still in their room, probably asleep, unaware of what was happening. And Holden, he was crouched in the corner now, rocking back and forth, his hands covering his ears as if that could block out the sound. "Please make it stop," Holden whimpered. His voice was barely audible over the chaos. The knocking wasn't just noise anymore. It was everywhere, pounding against the walls, the windows, the doors. It felt like the house itself was being shaken apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. For a moment, none of us moved. We stayed frozen in place, waiting for the next sound. But instead of knocking, we heard something else. A voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. But as it grew louder, I realized it was coming from the front door, and it was calling my name. It wasn't just my name, though. It called for Nina, for Holden, for all of us. The voices were wrong, twisted. They sounded like my parents, neighbors, even my sister, but something was off, something broken. "Open the door," they said, over and over again. "Let us in." I wanted to scream, to yell for my parents, but I couldn't. My voice was caught in my throat. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, the whistling started again. Da-da-da-da-dum. This time, it was right outside the window. I clenched my eyes shut, holding Nina close. "Don't look," I whispered again. I didn't know if I was saying it for her or myself. But Holden, he was already gone. He wasn't screaming anymore, just staring at the window, his face blank, his body still. Whatever he'd seen, it had taken something from him. And I knew it wasn't coming back. The whistling moved on, just like it always did. But nothing about that night felt normal. Holden's parents came for him the next morning, their faces drawn and pale as they led him away. He didn't speak to us, didn't even look at us. And when they left, they didn't come back. A week later, a moving truck pulled up to their house. Just like that, they were gone. After Holden opened the blind, everything fell apart. At first, it was just a silence, unnatural and suffocating, like the air had stopped moving. But then the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost polite, like a knock on the front door. But it didn't stay that way for long. Before we knew it, the sound was everywhere. Front door, back door, windows, walls. The house was under attack, as if something was trying to claw its way inside. Nina screamed and buried her face against my shoulder, her hands gripping me so tightly it hurt. "Make it stop," she sobbed. But how could I? I couldn't even move. The pounding grew louder, more violent, until it felt like the entire house might collapse. The floorboards shook beneath us. The walls creaked like they were about to split apart. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the knocking stopped. For a moment, I thought it was over. I thought maybe, just maybe, the whistler had moved on. But then I heard it, a voice. Faint at first, almost like it was coming from far away. "Call the police," it said. My mother's voice, or at least something that sounded like her. It repeated itself, over and over again. "Call the police. Call the police." The voice was calm, almost soothing, but something was wrong. Something off. And as it spoke, I realized it wasn't just coming from the front door anymore. It was everywhere. The windows, the walls, the ceiling. My mother's voice, echoing from every corner of the house, telling us to do something we all knew wouldn't help. Holden hadn't spoken since he looked out the window, but now he was mumbling under his breath. I couldn't make out what he was saying at first, but as I leaned closer, I caught the words. "It's watching me. It's watching me," over and over again, like a broken record. I didn't know what he'd seen, but whatever was had left him shattered. He wasn't Holden anymore. He was just empty. And that scared me more than anything else. The knocking came back, but it wasn't just the doors and windows this time. It was the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was like the entire house was being hammered from all sides. Nina was crying uncontrollably now, and I held on to her as tightly as I could, whispering that it would be okay even though I didn't believe it. And then the voice changed. It wasn't just my mother's voice anymore. It was my dad's, my sister's, even mine. They called out from the other side of the walls, mimicking us perfectly, like some cruel joke. "Let us in," they said. "Please let us in." And then we heard it again, the whistling, da-da-da-da-dum. It was faint at first, almost playful, mocking us. But as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't moving away this time. It was staying in place, right outside the window. I closed my eyes, refusing to look, but I could feel it there. Whatever it wasn't leaving this time. It wanted something, and I had a horrible feeling I knew what. Holden moved first. He stood up, his legs trembling, and started walking toward the window. "Holden, no!" I shouted, but he didn't respond. It was like he couldn't hear me anymore. He reached for the blind, his hand shaking as he touched the edge of the fabric. Before he could pull it open, the knocking stopped again. The house fell silent, but the silence was worse than the noise. It was heavy and oppressive, like the air was trying to smother us. And then the voice came back, louder than ever. "Let us in," it said. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream. I don't know how long it lasted. Minutes? Hours? It felt like an eternity. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The shadows faded. The knocking ceased. The house went still. The whistling was gone. The voices were gone. But something had changed. The house didn't feel safe anymore. It didn't even feel like home. It felt like we'd been marked. That night, I learned the truth about the whistler. It wasn't just a sound. It wasn't just a warning. It was something worse, something alive. And once you let it in, it never really leaves. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the blinds, it was as though the house had exhaled. The tension in the air vanished, leaving behind an unbearable silence. The whistling was gone. The knocking was gone. But nothing felt right. The terror had ended. But what it left behind was worse. I looked around at the night's wreckage, scattered furniture, overturned chairs. But my focus landed on Holden. He was sitting in the corner, knees drawn to his chest, staring blankly at the floor. He hadn't moved since the chaos stopped, and when I called his name, he didn't respond. He looked like a shell of himself, as if the light had been drained from his eyes. And I knew in that moment that whatever part of Holden had made him Holden, it was gone. Holden's parents came for him a few hours later. They must have known something was wrong the moment they stepped inside. My dad tried to explain, but there was no way to make sense of what had happened. Holden didn't speak to them. He didn't even look at them. He let them lead him out of the house like a puppet with its strings cut. I watched them leave from the window. Holden's mother kept glancing back at him, her face filled with worry, but his father looked angry. Not at Holden, at us. I could feel his glare as they walked to their car, but I couldn't blame him. What could we say? What could we do? Nothing would change what happened. By the end of the week, they were gone. I didn't see Holden again after that morning. His parents packed up their house in silence, their movements slow and mechanical, like they were going through the motions. The neighbors watched from their porches, whispering to each other but never offering to help. We all knew why they were leaving, and we all knew better than to talk about it. The last time I saw them, they were pulling out of the driveway, their car packed to the brim. Holden sat in the back seat, staring straight ahead. He didn't look back. He didn't wave. He just left. And the street felt emptier because of it. Nina and I didn't talk much about what happened that night. She didn't want to. And I didn't know how to put it into words. How do you explain a feeling like that? A fear that sticks to your skin like oil that follows you even in the daylight. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was over, but deep down, I wasn't sure it was. The house next door stayed vacant for months. No one wanted to move in, and no one wanted to say why. But I could feel it every time I walked past. It was like the air around it was heavier, thicker. Whatever happened that night had left a scar, not just on Holden but on the house itself. My dad didn't talk about that night either, but I could tell it haunted him. He spent hours at the kitchen table, staring at the manila folder, flipping through its contents like he was searching for an answer he'd never find. I wanted to ask him what was inside, but I was too afraid of what he might say. Too afraid it would confirm what I already knew. That this wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it wouldn't be the last. The neighborhood was quieter after that. Not in the way you'd expect. It wasn't peaceful. It was tense and heavy, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The neighbors didn't wave as much anymore, and when they did talk, it was always about the weather or the garden or anything but the whistler. The rule was clear. Don't talk about it. Don't think about it. Pretend it doesn't exist. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop hearing the whistling in my head, even though it hadn't returned since that night. I couldn't stop wondering what Holden had seen. And I couldn't stop wondering if one day I'd see it too. Life went on, as it always does. But nothing felt the same. The whistler hadn't just taken Holden's light. It had taken something from all of us. Our safety, our comfort. We believed that as long as we followed the rules, we'd be okay. And now, every night at 3:03 a.m., when the house is silent and the world outside is still, I lie awake listening, waiting, wondering if tonight will be the night the whistling comes back. Years have passed since that night. Holden and his family are long gone, but their absence lingers like a cold draft. The house next door has been sold twice since then. Each family moved out within months, citing reasons that never seemed right. It didn't feel like home, one woman said. Too quiet, said another. But I knew the truth. We all did. We still live here, though. My dad says it's because we can't afford to leave, but I think it's something else. I think it's the luck, the million little blessings that keep us tethered to this place, no matter how heavy the nights have become. My sister Nina doesn't talk about it anymore, and my mom keeps herself busy. But every night, when the clock approaches 3:03 a.m., my dad goes from room to room, checking the blinds and locking the latches. It's a ritual now, one we never question. Sometimes I wonder why we stay, why anyone stays. But then I remember the rules, the warnings, the things my dad said the welcoming committee told him that night we moved in. The whistler won't hurt you, they said, as long as you don't look. That's what keeps us here. That promise, that delicate balance between what we're given and what we could lose. Every night, without fail, the whistling returns. The same cheerful tune, da-da-da-da-dum, moving down the street like clockwork. It's not as loud as it used to be, or maybe I've just learned to block it out. But I still hear it, faint and haunting, just enough to remind me that it's still there, and that it's watching. The neighborhood doesn't feel the same anymore. It's quieter now, not with peace but with unease. The neighbors don't talk as much, and when they do, they avoid the subject. The welcoming committee hasn't visited anyone in years because no one new has moved in. The street feels frozen in time, like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to change. I lie awake most nights, waiting for the sound. Not because I want to hear it, but because I have to. It's like a clock ticking in my mind, counting down to the moment it begins. And every time it does, I wonder the same thing. What happens if the rules aren't enough? What happens if one day the whistler decides not to leave? Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. That's what my dad says when I ask him about the folder, about the stories inside. He won't tell me what's in it, and I think I'm glad for that. Because if I knew, I'd want to understand. And if I tried to understand, I might end up like Holden. Or worse. It's easier this way. To not know. To follow the rules, lock the blinds, and pretend the whistler is just another sound in the night. It's what keeps us safe. What keeps us lucky. And if there's one thing I've learned from living here, it's that some rules aren't worth breaking. So, if you ever hear a cheerful tune outside your window late at night, do yourself a favor. Don't look. Don't open the blinds. Don't wonder what's out there. Just lock the windows, close your eyes, and wait for it to pass, because some things don't like being seen. And once you do, they never really leave. Thank you for watching. If this story kept you awake tonight, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales that will make you question what you think you know about the world. And remember, some questions are better left unanswered